This is Northern Ireland, October the 5th, 1968. Irish nationalists have been demanding civil rights for many years. They have been discriminated in relation to housing, jobs, and voting rights. The leaders of the march have been inspired by similar marches in Washington and Paris. But this is different. This is Northern Ireland, and this is the first day of a 30-year conflict that becomes known as the Troubles. A month later, on the 4th of November, the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson requests the Northern Ireland leader Terence Neill and two of his cabinet colleagues to come to London for talks. Wilson is concerned at the escalating violent situation and instructs these ministers to bring about immediate reforms. However, the marches and violence continues, and on the 9th of December, Terence Neill, the Prime Minister, went on television to appeal for calm. He says that Ulster is at a crossroads and must choose between the path of peace and prosperity or violence and chaos. Unfortunately, O'Neill's appeal is largely ignored, and 1969 begins with a serious escalation of the Troubles. On the 4th of January, a new left-wing group known as the People's Democracy lead a long march from Belfast to Derry. They're met just outside Gerry by about 200 loyalists who attack them on a bridge, Burntalbot Bridge, a few miles outside Derry. Sticks and stones and bricks and bottles are thrown. Many of the marchers are badly injured, but they eventually make their way into the city, and this is followed by 3 days rioting in Derry. Marches and violence continue throughout the early months of 1969. Tensions build between the two communities. On the 12th of August, the Apprentice Boys, a loyalist group, hold their annual march through Derry. They are attacked by nationalists at the Bogside. What follows is known as the Battle of the Bogside. This involves 3 days of intense rioting with petrol bombs being hailed down on the police. Eventually, the police lose control of the situation and the British Army is brought in to restore order. In this situation, over 1,000 people are injured in these riots. In the South, Taoiseach Jack Lynch went on television to address the nation about his concerns and what his government's policy would be.
But it is clear now that the present situation cannot be allowed to continue. It is evident also that the Stormont government is no longer in control of the situation. Indeed, the present situation is the inevitable outcome of the policies pursued for decades by successive Stormont governments. It is clear also that the Irish government can no longer stand by and see innocent people injured and perhaps worse. Recognising, however, that the reunification of the national territory can provide the only permanent solution for the problem, it is our intention to request the British government to enter into early negotiations with the Irish government to review the present constitutional position of the 6 counties of Northern Ireland.
Meanwhile, in Belfast, loyalists see the Battle of the Bogside in Derry as a victory for nationalists. They react by burning thousands of nationalists out of their homes. And so in less than 12 months, the situation has gone from a demand from civil rights marchers to a violent conflict over national identities. Unionists were brought up to believe that discrimination against nationalists was necessary to ensure the survival of the state. Reforms therefore threatened the state in their view. That led to a conflict that lasted almost 30 years. Today we look at the history and first phase of that conflict. The history of Northern Ireland goes back to the early 17th century. In 1607, the chieftains of Ulster were forced to leave the country following their defeat by the English monarch. This became known as the Flight of the Earls. This was an important turning point in Irish history, in that before the defeat of the Earls, Ulster was the most Gaelic province in Ireland. Afterwards, it became a very different place. In the following decades, there was a huge influx of Scots and English. These were mainly Calvinists from Scotland and Anglicans from England, 2 early forms of Protestantism. The English monarch was determined to stamp out old Gaelic chieftain systems. This movement of people from England and Scotland became known as the Plantation of Ulster. Over the following decades and centuries, there was frequent battles and tensions between the new settlers and the native Irish. One major battle took place in 1690. This was known as the Battle of the Boyne between King William of Orange and King James II. This was part of an ongoing war for the British Crown. William's victory at the Boyne strengthened the settlers' claim in Ulster, and it is still commemorated by Orangemen every year on the 12th of July. In the 17th and 18th centuries, various conflicts continued throughout Ireland between the settlers and natives. However, by the late 18th century, these settlers were beginning to demand a parliament of their own. Henry Grattan was the most prominent leader of this movement, and he succeeded in getting a parliament for Ireland from 1782 to 1800. However, Grattan's parliament was never really democratic or representative of the Irish people. In 1798, the United Irishmen, led by Republican Wolfe Tone and inspired by the American and French Revolution, demanded complete Irish independence. However, this attempted rebellion failed, and the British government abolished Grattan Parliament completely in 1800 by the Act of Union. The Great Famine of the 1840s was a monumental event in Irish history. In the following decades, it gave rise to a new form of Irish nationalism and a demand for Irish independence. However, this demand was not shared by the most prominent voices in Ulster politics. Over the years, they had come to believe that their religion, culture, and heritage would be best protected under the English crown. So by 1912, they set up the Ulster Volunteers to resist Home Rule by force if necessary. Over the following decade, the north and south of Ireland moved in different directions politically. The south, through the Republicans of 1916, demanded complete independence from Britain, while the Ulster Unionists demanded a continued union with Britain. After almost a decade of wars and rebellion, both internal and external, these tensions came to a head. In 1920, the British government proposed the Government of Ireland Act, which was designed to divide Ireland into north and south and grant a Home Rule Parliament in each area. However, the South rejected this offer and fought for complete independence, while the North accepted it and became part of the United Kingdom. However, the nationalist minority were outraged with this arrangement and felt betrayed. They fought a war of resistance between 1920 and 22 over a 2-year period in which over 500 people died. In the early years, the Unionist majority believed it was necessary to suppress the minority and undermine their rights in order to survive as a state. Northern Ireland consists of 6 of the 9 counties of Ulster and is therefore sometimes known as the 6 counties. Cavan, Monaghan and Donegal were excluded because it was felt that their nationalist majorities could eventually endanger the union with Britain. The elections of 1921 established the new state, which met at City Hall, as Stormont wasn't built for another decade. Various laws were put in place which made nationalists feel like second-class citizens. The Special Powers Act gave police the power to arrest without trial and search without warrant. Nationalists were excluded from the top jobs in both the civil service and private industry. There was a huge levels of injustice in regard to jobs, housing and voting. All these measures were designed to guarantee the union. However, in many ways they had the opposite effect, and they eventually caused huge levels of violence, which in turn destabilized the state. The Unionists also formed a 2/3 majority government, and there was no opportunity to address injustices within the nationalist community. During the Second World War, Northern Ireland drew closer to Britain as they fought together on the war fields of Europe. Northern Ireland also supplied huge levels of thousands of planes and ships for the British war effort. However, after the war, the British Education Act of 1947 created opportunities for the Catholic nationalist community to receive a third-level education for the first time. This in turn led to civil rights leaders such as John Hume, Bernadette Devlin, and Eamon McCann leading the civil rights marches of the late 1960s. The civil rights marches were demanding equal treatment in regard to housing, voting and jobs. However, they were met with fierce resistance by the police and by militant Unionists. These Unionists had been led to believe that nationalists were a threat to the state, and the various laws and measures were needed in order to marginalise them and keep them weak. Such conflicting views led to civil marches, to violence, to riots, and to petrol bombs and stone throwing at police. By late 1968, such riots were becoming a daily occurrence, and violent scenes were shown on TV screens around the world. Some of the first major marches and violent scenes began in the Bogside of Gerry in mid-August 1969. These riots went on for 3 days. In the end, the police lost control of the situation and the British Army had to be brought in to restore order. These riots in turn created widespread violence throughout Northern Ireland, especially in Belfast, where Unionists and Loyalists responded by burning nationalists out of their homes. The British government responded to this situation by promising reforms in several areas. Local elections were reformed, one person, one vote replaced a system based on property. A complaints board was established. A new appointment boards were set up to oversee appointments to the civil service. Police reforms also took place. The B Specials were disbanded in 1970. Unfortunately, all of this was too little too late, as some of the forms, like breaking up the B Specials, angered the Unionist community, who had come to believe that these laws and measures were necessary to maintain the Union. Meanwhile, the IRA also began to re-emerge as a force in Northern Ireland. At first they appeared as a force defending nationalist areas. However, in December 1969, they split into two groups, moderates and hardliners. The hardliners became known as the Provos, or the Provisional IRA. Their aim was to force Britain out of Ireland. The Ulster Volunteer Force was also formed at this time to counteract the IRA. They had felt betrayed by the British government, who promised reforms and they believed would threaten the Union. By the early 1970s, the violence and bombing intensified between nationalists and Unionist paramilitary organisations. In March 1971, Brian Faulkner, a hardline Unionist, became Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. A few months later, he introduced a new policy, internment without trial. This was a desperate attempt to gain control of the situation. Hundreds of innocent Catholic nationalists were arrested who were suspected of being members of the IRA. In the Ballymurphy estate in Gerry, 11 civilians lost their lives in 3 days in August 1971. The policy of internment made a bad situation much worse. Henceforth, the Catholic community seen the British Army as the enemy, and the brutal nature of the internment drove dozens of young men into the arms of the IRA. In the months that followed, there were several anti-internment protests and marches and demands to have innocent civilians released. A few months later, in January 1972, one such march was attacked by the Parachute Regiment of the British Army, and 14 innocent civilians were shot dead. The marchers were unarmed and innocent, and these scenes were shown on TV screens around the world. This event is known as Bloody Sunday. It looked bad for Britain. The Stormont government had obviously lost control of the situation. 2 months later, in March 1972, the British government closed down the Stormont government in Northern Ireland. This began a period of direct rule from London and was seen as a major victory for the IRA. However, now the IRA came to believe that they could force a complete British withdrawal from Northern Ireland, and so 1972, unfortunately, became the worst year of the Troubles, with 472 deaths. However, the IRA misjudged the situation. Instead, the British government began to consider a new form of government for Northern Ireland. This became known as the Sunningdale Agreement. Sunningdale is in Berkshire, just a few miles outside London. There were 4 main parties involved in the talks: the Irish and British governments, and representatives of both the nationalist and unionist communities in Northern Ireland. The parties agreed to a power-sharing executive whereby both communities would be represented. So that's it for today. Thank you for watching. Next week I hope to cover the next 25-year period from 1973 until 1998, from the Sunningdale Agreement right up to the Good Friday Agreement. Feel free to comment on any of these issues, as there's various different viewpoints. And thank you again for watching, and all the best for now.